We've got amazing questions today. The main question, at least for this episode, is Brunswick Stew. Where does it come from? What are the origins? Thanks for joining us today on Questions and Answers with James Townsend and Son. So I've got some help today. I've got Kyle, our newest employee. He's off screen here. He's going to read out the questions for me. That way I don't have to pronounce the names. He's the newest employee here at James Townsend and Son. He does shipping and obviously he reads questions.
Hey John, this question is from Karen Ingram. Hello. I've read many articles about different crops, vegetables, and other things that existed hundreds of years ago, but are no longer around today because modern farming focuses on just a handful of varieties. My question is, are there recipes that you would like to try but cannot because ingredients no longer exist? I would be interested to learn more about what has sadly been lost to history. Thank you for your videos.
Karen, great question. And, actually it gets a lot deeper into what we do than just particular varieties that are lost. There are some really interesting crops that are out there that we don't have much access to. Chardoons, which are sort of a thistle thing. There's skirrets that are like these long, skinny white carrots that aren't easy to get a hold of. There's something like for us here in Indiana, eels, recipes with eels. We have no access to eels, but we're working on it. So not only are some varieties different, or you just can't get some kinds of crops anymore, but every kind of food that we have available to us today has been industrialized in some sort of way. Let's take example something like tomatoes. The tomatoes that we have available today in the store are nothing like tomatoes that would have been available 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and definitely 200 years ago. The tastes are different. The capability of, today's tomatoes are all about how can we get this tomato to market, not about what it tastes like. And that is replicated all over the food chain. The kind of corn we have, the kind of flour we have, it's all made so that it can be produced, the most efficient way possible, but not having anything to do about the flavor of the food. So no matter how hard we try today to get the right kind of ingredients, and even when we think we have the right kind of ingredients, the tastes they would have had back then certainly would have been much different.
All right, John, this question comes from Anthony, and it's on the curly fries video. In the cookbooks where you find these recipes, are there ever drawings to help explain a technique or a final product?
No, most of the cookbooks do not have any kind of illustrations. Occasionally you will have table layouts where they will say here's how your dishes should go on the table. Usually those for very high class, big fancy meals. And sometimes you'll get illustrations about how to truss particular animals. So, how their wings should go or where you put the legs on a rabbit or something like that. But other than that, almost no illustrations.
John, this question comes from My Opinion Doesn't Matter. Would it be hard to find that much oil to cook with back in the 18th century? I figure that oil in that quantity would be pretty expensive and deep frying would only be for the wealthier folk. Am I wrong?
I don't think that quantities of oil would have been that difficult to have. The animals in the time period were tended, especially something like hogs, had a lot more fat to them. And when you're butchering, you get a lot of oils out of that, a lot of fats. So there's no reason to believe that they would have been highly restricted in their ability to have fats to cook with.
John, this next question comes from John Gutzman. Hello, John, new subscriber, and I have a question. I love all the cooking segments, and I know you reference a lot of cookbooks. How prevalent were cookbooks during the 17 and 1800s for the average home? It seems to me that books were still expensive and would have been owned by the wealthy.
I think you pretty much nailed it. If I was going to answer this and take a lot of time, I think I would still come up with an answer pretty close to that cookbooks, especially printed cookbooks, were only available or only likely in households of pretty high means, at least middle class and upper class folks. and that most everybody else, they learned cooking from the previous generation, and there likely wasn't much transfer of fancy cookbooks. So I don't think you definitely see much of that. Even when you see sort of manuscript cookbooks that weren't printed, but just individuals writing those things out, they still tend to be pretty high class.
John, this next question comes from Celia Zanger. I've been doing medieval recipe reenacting and cooking for many years, and one of the things they used a lot was almond milk. It seems that they used it as a substitute for milk, but not because dairy intolerance, but because milk was not available or allowed for religious reasons during certain parts of the year, or in some places where it was difficult to raise cows. People who could not tolerate milk would not have been very healthy and may have not survived.
Yes, Celia, very good point. I did a little bit of digging, and definitely you'll see lots of almond milk in the medieval cookbooks. And it seems like it was mostly used in sort of Lenten situations where milk was restricted because of the religious ideas of that day. As those religious restrictions tended to get lessened as you go through the centuries, by the time you get to the 17th and 18th century, it isn't popular. And you don't see almond milk being substituted much in these cookbooks, at least in the English context. Possibly you might still see those in Italy or other places. But yep, very good point.
John, this next question is from Taylor Sheldon, and it's on the portable soup video. So you eat it like it is or reheat it?
Portable soup, it's like a bouillon cube, kind of. So it's definitely meant to be reconstituted and not eaten like it is. This is an ingredient that you would use in something else.
John, this question's from Richard McMakin. I'm new to your channel and absorbing as much as I can as quickly as I can. Thank you for all your videos. My question is this: how did they care for a cutting board in the 18th century?
Cutting boards. I don't think obviously they didn't really have the same kind of ideas about cleanliness and worried about, bacteria and things like that in the 18th century. They would have just washed it off, just wiped it off and good enough. And that kind of goes through with lots of different cleaning. They would have made sure things were clean because it would have affected the taste of the finished product that they were making, if they were a good cook even. So would they have cleaned their cooking board any special way? No, they would have just wiped it off and said good enough.
John, here's the question of the day. This question comes from Jab619. My question is about Brunswick Stew. I've read in a Native American cookbook that Brunswick Stew is based on an old Native American stew. According to what I read, the Native Americans would keep a pot of stew over the cook fire pretty much all of the time. Further, it said that the stew was largely used as a way to always have something on hand to serve guests, and that they would simply add more ingredients as the pot got a little low. I'm wondering when the earliest recipe for an Anglicanized version of Brunswick stew appeared. Also, modern Brunswick stew recipes, and I mean real Brunswick stew, often call for passing the vegetables through a food mill, I suppose to mimic the effect that being perpetually on the fire would have had for the native recipe. Were food mills or similar commonly used in the 18th century?
So Kevin did a little digging. He was digging up in the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink, and Brunswick stew definitely has its sort of origins in succotash, and succotash goes back into the 17th century. Definitely a Native American stew that was sort of adapted in this case into the European context. So it seems that there's multiple claims of ownership for Brunswick stew. Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. Apparently Brunswick County, Virginia seems to be the most likely place that it actually originated from, and it really does seem to be a sort of a 19th century adaptation of this earlier stew idea. The first real reference we see to it is 1855, and the first real recipe we see coming through to us is 1871 or so. So definitely seems to be a mid-19th century thing, at least when it's going by that name. Now this secondary question, this idea of food mills and changing the texture of the stew, they definitely had several different ways of doing that same kind of thing in 18th century cooking. Maybe not necessarily to emulate this long cooking process where all the vegetables kind of break down into a slurry, but many times they wanted to change the texture of a dish, and they would do that this same kind of a way. They would generally boil those vegetables a lot, and then they would pass them through a sieve to break them down into a smooth texture. Or if it was something that was a little harder, a meat or something they wanted to change the texture of, they would have used a mortar and pestle and just beat that down into a pulp. And that's very, very common way of treating it. So they had their own kind of food mill in the 18th century. So reading about history in a book, it's great fun and you can learn a lot. But if you want to really understand history, you've got to experience it. If you're interested in getting started with living history and experiencing history, you should try signing up for the Getting Started series that we're doing. It's a series of free video episodes along with written material about just what it takes to get started in living history. Instead of just, trying to figure it out on your own, we've kind of written you a roadmap. So it's a great piece of information and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So make sure, I'll put a link down in the description section so you can check that out. I want to thank everyone for your amazing, great questions, your wonderful encouragement. The kind of comments we get on the channel are just incredible. So I really want to thank you for all that you do. Thank you so much for watching. If you're a new viewer and you haven't subscribed, press the subscribe button up here. That'll take you to a spot where you can subscribe. I want to thank everyone for watching.